Good evening, everyone, and thank you for joining us tonight virtually to talk about voting reform and City Club research. I am Leslie Johnson, President-elect of City Club. As we start the program, I want to make an important acknowledgement. Most of us in North America live on stolen land. Here in the Portland region, this is the territory of the Multnomah, Cathlamet and Clackamas, the Tualatin, Kalapuya and Molalla, the Wasco, Cowlitz, and many other indigenous people who have known the Columbia and Willamette rivers as their home for thousands of years. Together, we recognize their unbreakable connections to this land, and we honor the resilience of their ancestors and the hope of future generations. I want to welcome my co-host tonight, Iris Maria Chavez. She is a longtime City Club member and governor. Iris, thank you for helping me out tonight.
Thank you, Leslie. It's my pleasure to be here with you on Zoom, where I've been spending a lot of time recently.
Me too. We're on Zoom again tonight, and those of you in the audience have been muted for the presentation portion of the evening. However, you can offer ideas and responses in the chat, and we hope that you do. After the presentation, you will be automatically moved into small discussion groups where you will not be muted at all. Before we get started, however, let's invite everyone to take a moment to write in the chat. We'd love to see your names, preferred pronouns, and a brief note about why you're here. It could even be just one word.
Like the word democracy? I think that's what I'd write. Like many of you out there, lately I've been thinking a lot about what works in Portland and what doesn't. We've seen communities mobilize campaigns for clean energy, preschool, libraries, and more. And since COVID, I've seen how we've taken care of each other by wearing masks, maintaining distance, and making an extra effort to support small businesses. This spring and summer, I also saw many of you out there marching in the streets or lying down on the Burnside Bridge, demanding a meaningful response to generations of violence against Black people in this city and around the world. We've also witnessed a city council that has been slow to respond to the crises we're facing, a council that feels disconnected from the people. All 5 city council members are voted at large, meaning they are elected by the entire city, and they each have different bureaus under their control. The question we have to ask ourselves tonight is that working? Especially in times of crisis like we're experiencing right now, do we think the commission form of government is capable of meeting the moment?
That's right. At City Club, we've been asking a lot of questions about the structure of Portland's government. 2 separate volunteer research committees have spent portions of the last 3 years examining Portland's form of government and how we vote. Each report gathered ideas for how we can all work together to build a new government, an equitable system that represents the diverse histories, experiences, and interests of all Portlanders. As you'll hear from tonight's speakers, one big conclusion that emerged from this research is this: our form of government, the commission form of government, is inequitable and in need of significant reform.
So we'll start out tonight's program with a video from the research committee. Then we'll hear from Commissioner-elect Carmen Rubio, who will talk about her experiences running for office in Portland. We'll then turn to a couple of experts on voting and elections, Kirsten Eberhard of the Sightline Institute and Fernando Hernandez of Fair Vote.
Once we've heard from our invited speakers, it will be your turn to talk about the kind of government you want to see in Portland. At a little after 7 p.m., we'll be forming breakout groups where you and a few other participants can discuss the research report, share ideas or experiences, and gather questions for our panel discussion.
The panel discussion will follow the breakout groups and will include Mark Stefan and Jenny Lee from City Club's Research Committee, and Kirsten Eberhard and Fernando Hernandez are voting experts. Finally, once the talking is over, if you're a City Club member, you'll get a chance to vote on whether to adopt or reject the latest research. This is a tradition that goes back more than 100 years and is what determines whether City Club is able to advocate for the research findings. During tonight's event, if you're a City Club member, you should receive an email that will allow you to cast your vote on the research. If you think you're a City Club member and did not receive that email, please send us a message to info@pdxcityclub.org.
We're almost ready to get started with tonight's program, but first I want to express our deepest gratitude to the research committee members who worked on this recent report. Mark Stefan, Jordan Cole, Shanice Clark, Jenny Lee, Paulina LePerry, Ricardo Luthon, Nathan Navum, Carissa Page, and Robin Yee. You've done outstanding work and have given us a lot to discuss. This has been an unusually difficult year for many reasons. For this committee, you expected your hard work and research to be shared back in March, and that didn't happen. But you have remained dedicated to this project through the spring, the summer, and the fall, through changes in City Club staff and board leadership, and through months in which the city's charter reform process itself was uncertain. I really just want to say that this kind of volunteer leadership is what City Club is all about. You are leaders for our community, and we thank you. I also want to express our appreciation for tonight's sponsors, More Equitable Democracy and Luke Caney's. We genuinely appreciate your helping us create a civic space for this conversation.
All right, is everyone ready to get started? First up is the research committee. Mark Stefan, Carissa Page, Jordan Cole, and Paulina LePerry pre-recorded a socially distanced roundtable discussion about the committee's work. This is an abridged version of the video, but the full recording is available on the research page of our website. So let's watch.
As some of you may remember, early in 2019, the Portland City Club released a landmark report that sparked a wide conversation about what kind of system of government we want to have here in Portland. Specifically, the report was focused on Portland's antiquated and quirky commission form of government. In this system, commissioners serve as both legislators and executives, in city bureaus that aren't assigned to them until after they're elected, might not have anything to do with their previous expertise, and can change at any time. Last year's committee came to a clear and compelling conclusion that this system of government is deeply inequitable and extremely inefficient. It's important to note that the system of at-large voting is closely tied to the commission form of government. Otherwise, if the city were to divide into districts, you could end up in a situation where a representative from one district was responsible for all the city's parks or all of its utilities, which could lead to really corrupt results. Because last year's report strongly recommended changing the commission form of government, the City Club realized that it was also important to study the separate but closely related issue of voting, and that's what led to them commissioning this committee.
Our current city council is one of the most diverse it has been in history, and yet when you really look at the history of the Portland City Council, we know that it has not had the sort of diversity that it could. The Sightline Institute has actually pointed out some really important information about this that kind of gives us a sense of how bad it's been. If you look over the last 30 years, for example, and you look at the number of years that commissioners have been on the City Council, or the number of years altogether that have been served, over 2/3 of those years have been served by council members who come from the most affluent neighborhoods, or at least some of the most affluent neighborhoods in all of Portland. We've only had one council member who's been from North Portland, and only two who have come from east of 82nd. The fact is that in terms of people of color as well on the council, we have just not lived up to expectations. Part of the reason for this clearly has to be the at-large election system that we have. A system where city council members are elected citywide, not in particular districts. For a variety of reasons, this is problematic. 49% of the voters can consistently be left out of proper representation for their interest. And this is a point of concern. This sort of distorted representation has been a problem in other cities in the past. And partly for this reason, almost every major city in this country has gotten rid of at-large representation. Since 1965, whether voluntarily or through lawsuits, most cities have chosen to move in a different direction. In fact, there are only two cities, Portland and Columbus, who still use this form of representation.
How has this affected the outcomes here in Portland?
If you come from certain communities or certain neighborhoods in Portland, you're far less likely to have a voice in City Hall. And regardless of where you live, you have no representative to call your own. Well, let me give you an example to illustrate how this type of system impacts the kind of outcomes we see. Fairly or not, many people in Portland consider 82nd Avenue to be a boundary line. Never mind that east of 82nd is home to 30% of Portland's population and 40% of its youth. It's also the most diverse and rapidly growing part of Portland. But this is a part of Portland that also has seen a clear and long-standing backlog of neglect. From inadequate sidewalks to streets, lights, sewer systems. Part of the issue is that Portland upholds a system in which no one is answerable to this geographic area. Other than Joanne Hardesty, the only other commissioner to have hailed from east of 82nd is Randy Leonard, who left council in 2012. This is also part of Portland that is less likely to vote and far less likely to donate to political campaigns. You know, I think more work needs to be done to understand why east of 82nd has lower voter turnout. But generally speaking, I think that when people feel disenfranchised, when they feel like their vote doesn't matter, they're naturally going to be less enthused about participating in the system. So first and foremost, we adopted an equity lens to guide our work. We also agreed to 7 principles, all rooted in equity considerations to inform our analysis. We tried to talk to as many people as we could in the time frame we had. We wanted to hear from a diverse range of voices to learn different aspects of the issue and hear competing viewpoints and triangulate findings to draw our own conclusions. We talked to voting experts at think tanks and universities in Portland and across the country. We talked to somebody who ran the Districts Now campaign in 2013 in Seattle, as well as some change experts, some people who ran change campaigns in California. We also talked to a couple commissioners who each offered a unique point of view. In addition, we talked to a panel of community leaders hailing from various community-based organizations in Portland. And speaking for me personally, that's the one that impacted me the most.
We really want to make sure we recognize the importance of hearing from communities who have been historically marginalized by the current system of government about the reasons why they choose to vote or not, to understand their perspectives about representation, and to hear from them about what kinds of solutions would best address their concerns. Our committee's report is one part of a much larger conversation, and in particular, we know that the City of Portland is currently assembling a charter review commission to take a hard look at these issues and many others. We hope and expect that the commission will be intentional about elevating the voices of historically marginalized communities as part of this process, because that ultimately is the point. We need diverse voices at the table to make sure that city government is really, really working for all the communities that it's meant to work for.
We need to move to an electoral system where all of the voting happens when most people vote in November. The system we have now, the 2-step process of primaries and the general election, actually mean that a huge number of voters are not involved in a lot of decision making because they're not voting in the primaries in May. If we move to something like ranked choice voting in particular, we could deal with this problem and have all of the voting occurring in November when the bulk of voters are participating. Portland likes to think of itself as weird, but this is not a characteristic of our politics that we should be proud of. So we need to move away from at-large voting. We also support, as a committee, and strongly so, a multi-member district form of government. A lot of people out there aren't necessarily familiar with multi-member districts, but the basic idea is that multi-member districts allow greater representation of minority interest in a given district. They allow wider representation in that district. Implementing this requires, on some level, some sort of proportional representation to make it really work effectively. So this would involve some other changes as well. This sounds complicated, but really it isn't that complicated. A number of cities have been doing this already. with success, and it is something that we can replicate.
In the past 9 months to year, Ranked Choice Voting, or RCV, has really gained a lot of momentum in places around the US. I'll just illustrate a few examples. In New York City, late last year, voters decided to move toward ranked choice voting beginning in 2021. This is a really big deal because New York City is by far the largest place in the US to put RCV to the test. By the time all of you are watching this, Maine will have become the first state to use RCV in a presidential election, although 4 states did already use it in their primaries. Voters in Massachusetts and Alaska also decided whether to implement RCV for some of their statewide races. And right here in Oregon, Benton County just became the first to use RCV for their county commissioner race. And I understand there are some representatives working to bring a statewide initiative to use RCV in Oregon.
A lot has happened in the last 8 months, and not just a global pandemic. As you all know, Portland has been the epicenter of racial justice protests in the United States. In addition, voting rights have very much been in the national spotlight as we head into an election with historic levels of voter suppression. And when Ruth Bader Ginsberg, RBG, passed away a little over a month ago, I couldn't help but recall some of her words that she wrote in her scathing dissent in 2013 when the Supreme Court gutted the Voting Rights Act of 1965. In that dissent, she said that the work wasn't finished, that there were major issues that remained. And she named 2, quote, second-generation issues. 1, gerrymandering, and 2, at-large voting. We have the largest call for racial justice since the 1960s. I think it's sad that Portland is one of 2 large cities in this country that continues to maintain this form of voting. We like to think of ourselves as progressive, but if we're serious about racial justice, I think changing the way we vote is one of the first things we need to do. The recent events have only made clear that the need for action is urgent. It needs to happen now.
Thank you, Mark, Carissa, Paulina, and Jordan, and your volunteer videographer, Anna, too. So it strikes me that Portland has only ever had 2 commissioners live east of 82nd, and it's a place where we see some of the lowest voter turnout, infrastructure, and social needs. Which makes me beg the question, or pose the statement, representation matters, right?
It reminds me of an older adage, not about us without us. Now let's hear from Commissioner-elect Carmen Rubio, who is the first Latina ever voted to Portland City Council.
Hi, thank you City Club for inviting me to speak with you today. I'm really grateful for the opportunity to be here with you and share a few brief reflections on my experiences as a recent political candidate. My name is Carmen Rubio and I'm a Portland City Commissioner-elect. And I won the May primary and will be sworn in January as the first Latinx woman to be elected to Portland City Council. I've dedicated my career to public service and to building power in the Latinx and immigrant communities, and also to advocating for government to be more accessible to all the people that it represents, and especially to Black, Indigenous, and people of color, working families, and low-income communities. It has been an established belief for a long time that to win a seat on council, you had to raise a lot of money and to have the support of more affluent neighborhoods and people. And that belief has driven the selection and self-selection of candidates who fit that profile, and discouraged people like me who don't fit that profile to be perceived as viable and appropriate city council candidates to run for public office. This was a big reason why I never believed Portland City Council was an option for someone like me. I knew I had valuable ideas to contribute, but I also knew that candidates of color have to work harder, longer, and face more scrutiny because we are up against a system not designed to include us. And even knowing this, many candidates of color have run numerous times despite the odds being stacked against them. Many had solid qualifications and experiences, but only a very few of us, 4 to be exact, were successful. and unfortunately, exclusionary systems make elections like mine the exception and not the rule. And during my campaign, I experienced several of these challenges that prior candidates of color and non-wealthy candidates also experienced. As an early qualifier for the Open and Accountable Elections program, I had sizable, smaller donor support, and I was able to be more competitive in fundraising by leveling out with large contributions. Public campaign financing is an important step in creating more access and curbing the influence of money in campaigns, but it is not a panacea for electoral and government transformation. Transformation requires a constellation of several reforms to truly create an environment and a landscape where more candidates of color and more candidates from different geographic areas, incomes, and lived experiences can successfully run. So here are a few of my thoughts on my experience. First, we need a system that doesn't require you to be wealthy to run. Under the current system, candidates must run and win citywide, which is really difficult in a city of this size. Citywide elections deter working people who cannot afford to take time off work to campaign from running for office. It was incredibly difficult for me as a nonprofit director and other candidates as well that I would see to work and do the fundraising and voter engagement required to win in a city of 655,000 people. Second, we need districts to ensure that we have equitable representation from all areas of our city. Districts would enable our city council to be more representative of all parts of our city and would result in better, more equitable policy and investments. And we have countless examples that show us time and again that when racially diverse candidates are elected, better engagement and better policies with real results happen. Residents would also benefit from knowing their local candidates understand their issues because they are invested in the same community. Third, we need an updated government structure that supports the size, values, and needs of the Portland that we are today. In the current structure, progress on many of the issues I campaigned on will, to some degree, depend on what bureaus I'm assigned. But as a candidate, I heard over and over from voters about the challenge of navigating multiple bureaus or multiple council offices on a given issue that intersects across several bureaus. We need a new form of government that will allow commissioners to work together toward a unified vision for the city and develop a strategic path to lead us into a future of social and economic health and stability. An improved structure will engage the council collaboratively on cross-cutting issues and solutions that better integrate and support the work across bureaus. This will ensure that we're making progress on that vision for our city. And finally, fourth, we need to continue publicly financed elections. It would have been financially impossible for me to run a campaign and reach Portlanders in all parts of the city without open and accountable election. This last cycle, we had a more diverse city council candidate pool for multiple races, maybe more than we've ever had. And we now know that this works. And with some tweaks, it will become an even more important tool over time to hold the door of access open. So clearly, these are not new ideas, but my experiences and the experiences of many before me underscore what we already know. It's time for a change. And what we've lacked in years in the past is a real community conversation about how our current structures are or aren't working for us, and what might be the right changes for Portland. Portland is ready for this conversation. So far, 2020 has been one resounding call for change in the way our institutions operate and represent us, and in the demands for dismantling of outdated systems that uphold white supremacy. By investing in a community process, we enable more people to have a say in how our government represents who Portland is now and in future generations. Proponents of the current form of government have argued that the recent election of 2 women of color, Commissioner Hardesty and myself, is an argument against change. But the bottom line is that this electoral system and form of government hinders true and timely representation of the diversity of Portlanders. I was elected in spite of our current form of government, not because of it. It shouldn't have taken more than 100 years to elect people like us. And in a community that still experiences hate crimes and is hitting its 160th day of protesting violence against Black lives, and where communities of color still suffer from some of the highest racial disparities in the nation, a system that structurally excludes the possibility of a more accurate representation means that under this system, these disparities will only continue to grow. So count me in as a supporter for change, and I look forward to the deliberations of the upcoming Charter Commission and in City Club events and discussions like these. I know that we all love our city, and we want to make it one that lives up to the values of representation and inclusion and justice and equity. But it will take all of us dialoguing to get there, and we are just getting started. I want to thank you for the opportunity to be here with you today, and thank the City Club for tackling this important work ahead of us. Thanks.
Insightful and inspiring. Thank you, Commissioner-elect Rubio. Now we'll hear from a couple of researchers at nonprofit think tanks that have been looking closely at how we vote in the US and how alternatives to the usual first past the vote post election might produce more equitable representation. Our first guest tonight is Kirsten Eberhard from the Sightline Institute. In her new book, Becoming a Democracy, How We Can Fix the Electoral College, Gerrymandering, and Our Elections, she breaks down how the US election system shuts out a portion of the population and makes some votes matter more than others. She'll discuss how districts might work in Portland, both for the voters and for candidates. After Kirsten, we'll hear from Fernando Hernandez, Senior Policy Coordinator at Fair Vote, a national nonpartisan organization that champions election reforms with the goal of giving voters greater choice, a stronger voice, and a representative democracy that works for all Americans. Although the report does not recommend a specific voting method, and instead reviews a few alternatives that have been demonstrated to increase representation, we asked Pedro to deep dive and take us into the nitty-gritty of how one alternative voting method might work, just to get us out of the theoretical and into the mechanics. We're going to listen to them back to back so that we can keep things rolling.
Hi, I'm Kirsten Eberhard, the Director of Democracy at Sightline Institute. Sightline is a nonpartisan, nonprofit think tank here in the Northwest, and I live in Portland. And I'm very excited to talk to you today about how we can give more Portlanders a voice on City Council. So one of the problems we have right now, so I'm going to talk about two of the values that the committee identified. So the first one is this idea that Portlanders should have access to someone at City Hall who represents their interests. And one of the problems with the current system is just geography. We see that most of the councilors in the last 25 years have lived in West Side and Inner Northeast. Bigger dots on this slide indicate more years served on council. And the other problem is just numbers. So in an at-large election, it means that 51% of voters can elect 100% of the councilors. And that means that 49% of voters don't send anybody to City Hall on their behalf. So districts can help with the geographic distribution. It means that at least you're going to have somebody from Northeast, somebody from East Side, but it doesn't solve that numbers problem if it's single winner districts. So in a single winner district, you still have the same situation that somebody with 51% of the votes goes to City Hall and the other 49% of the voters don't send somebody. So up to 49% of Portlanders not having somebody represent them in City Hall is a lot. And it also means that people of color might not get representation if we just use single winner districts. And the reason is that people of color, although they make up about a third of Portlanders, they're somewhat distributed. So here's those 4 districts again. And if we zoom in, we see that the most people of color on the East Side at 37%. So they're still not making it to that point where they're guaranteed to be able to elect somebody. So you still might end up with 0 people of color in City Hall, even with districts. And just in case you're wondering, more districts doesn't really make this better. Here's 8 districts. I asked the map maker to try to draw a minority majority district, and the closest he could get on the East Side was 38%. So still not quite enough. Now, in contrast, let's say we expanded the council to 12 members and elected 3 from each of 4 districts. So that's the same 4 districts we saw before, but now each of them is electing 3 councilors instead of just 1. So assuming you have a ranked choice ballot, that means that at least 76% of voters is going to send somebody they voted for to City Hall. So that is a better guarantee of representation, fewer Portlanders who don't have a voice. Okay, let's say we only want to expand it to 8, which would still be a pretty small council for a city of Portland size, but we could split the city into 2 districts and send 4 councilors from each district. And now you actually get even higher representation because you got 4 councilors from each district. You guarantee that at least 81% of voters are sending somebody that they voted for to City Hall. And under this scenario, it's also very likely that people of color get representation. So one district has nearly 20% people of color, the other has about 37%. So assuming that they're all voting together for a candidate, they're guaranteed to get somebody from their district representing them in City Hall. So the second value from the committee that I would like to talk about is this idea that we should make it more accessible for people to run for office. So right now, to run an at-large campaign in a presidential year, a candidate for city council needs to win around 125,000 votes. And campaigning for that many votes costs a lot. It's out of reach for many people. But with the multi-winner districts and ranked choice voting, candidates need to get a lower number of votes. They're running in a smaller area and also getting a lower number of votes. So that scenario of 8 councilors from 2 districts, you only need about 25,000 votes to win. And with 12 councilors coming from 4 districts electing 3 winners each, you only need about 15,000 to win. So that is much more achievable, even if you don't have a big bank account. If you want to go out and get 15,000 votes, that is more accessible. So one final point I want to make is that ranked choice voting could help Portland eliminate or at least de-emphasize primaries, and that alone would give more Portlanders a voice. So right now, about twice as many people vote in the general as in the primary. That's in Portland, that's about 100,000 people who turn out for the general who didn't vote in the primary. And in Portland, in the last 10 years, most of the city council races have ended in the primary. So that means the primary was the race. Those primary voters were the voters. And by the time the general election voters showed up, those 100,000 people did not get to vote on who goes to city council. So who are those primary voters who are ultimately choosing most of our city council members? They tend to be older than people who vote in the general and quite a bit older than the general population. And they tend to be whiter. So people of color make up a higher percentage of general election voters than of primary voters. So making the primary really the election robs 100,000 Portlanders, including younger people and people of color, of their voice. But with ranked choice voting, Portland could just get rid of the primary entirely, which would have the added benefit of shortening the election season, which would also help make running more accessible to people who don't have to spend quite as much time campaigning. And even if we do retain the primary, at least we would know the race would not end there. So general election voters would still get to have their say. They'd still get to rank their choices, even if there was a primary to narrow the field. In closing, I'd like to point out that we know how well multi-winner ranked choice voting works. Cambridge, Massachusetts is somewhat similar to Portland in its demographics, and it has been using multi-winner ranked choice voting for decades to help elect both its city council and its school board. And the result has been that representatives there better reflect the voters than they do here in Portland. So we can make it more accessible for anyone to run and give more Portlanders a voice on the council. I would be very happy to discuss any of my research further. Thank you very much.
Good evening. My name is Fernando Hernandez. I'm the Senior Policy Coordinator at Fair Vote. Fair Vote is a nonpartisan nonprofit organization that champions electoral reforms and gives voters greater choice and a stronger voice in a more representative democracy that works for everyone. Fair Vote is based in Tacoma Park, Maryland, but I live over here on the West Coast in San Francisco. The City Club has asked me to do a short video about how ranked choice voting works both for single winner ranked choice voting and proportional ranked choice voting. However, there is a longer video that you can watch that goes a little more deeply into the way these systems work and the way modified at-large systems work, which you can find on the resources page that they are making available via Medium. So why don't we get started here? So for those not familiar with ranked choice voting, this is a quick overview. Under ranked choice voting, voters get a ballot and they rank candidates in order of preference. First, second, third, and so on. And then we count everyone's first choices. If a candidate receives more than half of the first choices, they win, just like any other election. But if not, the candidate with the fewest amount of votes is eliminated, and the voters who pick that candidate have their vote count for their next choice on the ballot. And that's how we get our winner. And this process continues in rounds until a candidate emerges with over half the votes. This is the system that San Francisco, Oakland, Berkeley, and San Leandro adopted to eliminate costly runoff elections. But it's led to benefits that I'll describe in just a few slides. The state of Maine also became the first state to adopt this statewide and recently used it in the presidential election. The other form of ranked choice voting is proportional ranked choice voting. It's the proportional representation form of ranked choice voting, which is also known as single transferable vote. The ballot is the same with proportional ranked choice voting. Voters get to rank candidates in order of preference, just like the single winner ranked choice voting, and votes are also counted in rounds. But what changes? Ranked choice voting operate on the principles of election thresholds, which is the number of votes necessary to guarantee election. For example, when electing one candidate, a candidate with over 50% will be a winner because no other candidate can have over 50%. When electing two, this threshold goes down to just over a third, since no third candidate can have that same amount. So, the number of votes necessary to win decrease as the number of seats for election go up. In this example, I'll describe a three-winner contest where the threshold to win is 25% plus one. Well, the process is the same. We count everyone's first choices. If someone has 25% of the vote, they would win. And if not, we would go to round two. And then the candidate with the fewest votes is eliminated, and the votes for that candidate are then counted for those voters' next choices. Here we don't have all of our three winners, so we do something a little bit different here. Because we don't want to unnecessarily defeat candidates or punish voters who support popular candidates, and what we're striving for is a more reflective representation of voter preferences, we do something called surplus transfer. So think of your vote like a dollar. But say you only needed to spend 90 cents of your dollar to elect a candidate of choice. 10 cents can then count for your next choice. This method of ranked choice voting is not new. It is used by every voter in Australia, Ireland, New Zealand, Malta, Northern Ireland, Scotland, often with multi-winner proportional form of ranked choice voting. And this is what municipalities use in New Zealand as well as Ireland, Cambridge, Massachusetts, East Point, and a Parksport in Minneapolis. And pretty soon we'll probably see it in use in Palm Desert and Albany, California. In my role, I actually closely study ranked choice voting elections, and I live in a city that uses it too. In the Bay Area, it's meant greater choice and a more powerful vote. It empowers communities to build coalition, and I've seen greater unity among groups who dual endorse candidates because they don't want to break their coalition, or its members might have preferences about who they want to support. It has led to more civil campaigns. Ranked choice voting creates a more issue-focused and civil campaign. It gives candidates incentives to work together, or at least not criticize each other too harshly. in hopes of earning a voter's first, second, or third choice. A fair vote study of Bay Area elections through 2016 showed a significant increase in offices won by women and people of color since ranked choice voting was adopted, because instead of running for 2 elections, you run for 1, and it allows for a campaign atmosphere that incentivizes more collaborative candidates. So why do these things and changes matter? Well, we all deserve to have a fair and equal opportunity to elect candidates of choice. Sizable voting groups ought to have a seat at the table, and when important voices are left out, we might not be getting the best policy solutions. So some of these reasons are, I think, reasons why to think about considering a change to a political geography, because we should try to make our democracy more rigorous in responding to the concerns of the population. Thank you so much for your time listening to this presentation and for your careful consideration about where you want your city to be. I think these are very important decisions that actually have a huge impact on people's everyday lives. So your thoughtfulness is appreciated. Thank you so much.
Wow, that's a lot to digest, and it's interesting to me to see how many places around the country have adopted methods that really aim to be inclusive of their diverse communities. And I thank both of our researchers for sharing that with us. So now it's time for our breakout sessions. It's time to hear all of your thoughts and questions. So in a moment, you will be randomly placed in a virtual meeting space with a handful of other people. Each breakout room will choose a facilitator and a note taker who will go over the goals of the session and ensure everyone has an opportunity to contribute to the discussion. If any questions come up in your group, you or your note taker will write them down in a Google Doc, which we'll share in the chat, and we'll use that Google Doc to help guide the discussion with our panelists. Sound good? All right. Welcome back, everyone. I'm sorry to tear you away from the discussion you were having. I know very much what it feels like when you're just about to explain your aha moment and everyone disappears. But here we are, back together again. We've learned a lot tonight. We've been a part of some interesting discussions. Now we'd like to close out the evening with the Roundtable panel to discuss the voting methods and answer your questions that you brought up in the chat. So we'd like to welcome back Kirsten Eberhard from the Sightline Institute, Fernando Hernandez from Fair Vote, and Mark Stefan and Jenny Lee from City Club's Research Committee. And I'd like to congratulate Jenny because she recently became the Deputy Director of the Coalition of Communities of Color, and we're very excited about that. So congratulations, Jenny. So I am now going to pop over to the questions that you all generated during your conversations in the breakout rooms and pose those to our panelists. So I think I'm going to start with a question that came up for the research committee members. It seems like the specific form of voting, ranked choice or star or something else, is a really important change. Why didn't you pick one? Stefan, Jenny, feel free to take that.
Maybe I'll start. I think the simple answer is that the committee thought about this a lot and did not conclude that any one of them stood out so much from the rest that we were in a position as a committee to sort of say, this is the method. We were more focused on the outcome, on increasing participation, increasing representation, increasing equity. And so all of these different methods have their pluses and minuses, and I look forward to more debate about them, but our sense was that us picking this was not the appropriate way to do it. It really was something that needs to happen sort of farther down the line.
I would just add that it really kind of leaves us with almost like an empirical question about the method and understanding what works really well for our communities, kind of considering Portland has some specific considerations, and really beyond the kind of scope through the research process. And then that was really where we began the engagement, robust engagement of community to understand how would this work effectively for Portlanders.
Thank you. We appreciate that. We know that there is a ton for you all to consider. And so here's a question, maybe Pedro or Kristen. Does RCV, ranked choice voting, have issues with the spoiler effect?
I can go first. For what the committee recommended was multi-winner districts. And so the spoiler effect doesn't quite have the same power in a multi-winner race. So if you've got 3 people winning a race, then the top 3 are going to win in a ranked choice voting. Spoiler is usually more for a single winner race where maybe you have 2 candidates who are pretty close and a third who siphons off votes from one of them. It doesn't have quite the same dynamic in multi-winner.
Yeah, I'll add that if you have more than 1 or 2 like-minded candidates and you're looking at the number of seats, it's very possible that some other modified at-large system might be more susceptible to a split vote, leading to a spoiler. For example, cumulative voting, if there's not enough coordination among voters to plump their votes towards one person or that same person, you can end up with an election where that person doesn't win. Or with limited voting, if you have more than 1 candidate and the community kind of rallies around one but ends up voting for 2 or 3, then you can have that same kind of dynamic happen. With a ranked ballot in a multi-seat setting, you would be able to rank those candidates in order of preference and mitigate the effect of that spoiler effect even in multi-seat districts.
Thank you. That's interesting. Kristen, is there a question for you? Someone in one of the breakout groups said, I missed the premise about having 51% of people being represented. How is that? Reflecting back on some of the modeling that you showed.
I'm sorry, could you explain that a little bit more? I'm not sure I understand the question.
Well, unfortunately, I only have that specific question, and I don't have the ability to get further context.
Okay,
from the podcast.
So can you say it again?
Yeah. The question was, I missed the premise about having 51% of people being represented. How is that?
Maybe this is asking, so in the at-large system that Portland has right now, if you had a situation where 51% of the voters wanted a certain type of candidate, then they could put that type of candidate in every single one of the council positions. So that 51% of voters would end up with 100% of the representation on council, and the other 49%, because you couldn't get to that 51% threshold in any single one of the races, then you get 0 on the council. Whereas a more fair representation would say, hey, 51%, yeah, you get the majority on the council, but that the other people in Portland who voted for something else still have a voice on council.
Thank you. If we have a follow-up question, we will send it along to you from the participant in that breakout room. Next question I want to direct to our research committee members. Why did the group not consider a model like Seattle, where there are mostly districts but a few at-large seats? Or did you?
I mean, the simple answer is that we did. And we did think about a variety of different models besides sort of multi-member districts. We talked about single-member districts. We thought through sort of pros and cons. And one thing that stood out for us, and I'm happy to have further dialogue at some future point with people about this, is we could not see significant benefits to a hybrid system with at-large. We did not see the benefits of at-large, certainly outweighing just moving completely to a district system. At-large, mixed with districts, maybe has some positives in theory, but in practice it can be problematic, because you then have members of a council who are arguing that they represent the city as a whole, for example, and the other district representatives are only representing a district. So that gives them sort of special status for representing the whole city. Those sort of factors are sort of dynamics that split the district representatives from the at-large are problematic, and were problematic to us. And so we moved more fully and forcefully to the idea of districts and multi-member districts. That's still a simple answer, not a complex answer.
Thank you. I appreciate that. So where shall we go next? Like the privilege of the moderator of the questions. Gotta kind of figure out where to go. Here's one that I think is really interesting based on all of the information that you guys gave us earlier. Pedro, when you're considering how you would map out districts to ensure representation, how do you weigh or evaluate the, I guess, the different considerations that we heard earlier? Geographic diversity, income, racial, ethnic diversity, when we think about doing that?
I would say probably the one that most people are concerned about is probably the one that comes to mind, which is, how do you make sure that communities of interest stay together, and how do you ensure that they have an opportunity to cast a meaningful ballot in a contest where they will have influence over that election, or have the opportunity to elect a candidate of choice. And depending on the geographic dispersion of those communities, that could be a single member district for some people, but it could also be a fair election method for other people as well, meaning that a multi-member district with ranked choice voting would lower the amount of votes it takes to win to a threshold where it's fair. And that threshold might be more accessible for those growing communities in those communities that are not geographically dispersed. So those are kind of the balances. And I think, district size, there are federal rules around like making sure that they're roughly the same population, et cetera. What tends to be the driving factor, though, for folks interested in representation of communities is, where are those communities?
Thank you. So a little bit of a more internal thinking on that question. Jenny, I'm wondering if you might want to address this one. Question from a breakout room. There doesn't appear to have been equal representation on the research committee. Can you speak to that? Do you consider this report to be representative?
So understanding the question is that the representation of the individuals serving on the research committee weren't necessarily representative. Well, I felt we ended, okay. All right, just making sure I'm understanding. I think that we ended up with the folks who were on it. We were able to work really successfully together. I think most of the folks of color who were serving on the committee in some way engaged pretty, actually professionally in kind of advocacy for communities of color. So I feel like that, positioned us well to, because of that professional and community background, I felt like we were able to work very effectively with our white colleagues to talk about some of the underlying issues and assumptions that would go into it, particularly around how we were presenting, what recommendations, the kind of the reason we were so mindful was really through our research committee, the panels that we held, especially when we brought in some folks who we work with, or I worked with through our kind of advocacy and organizing work and my day job. And I felt like that was a really, profound moment where it was a great example of the type of things that can happen at City Club, where, because as we're building a space where there's more engagement of BIPOC Portlanders are able to engage pretty authentically and have actually some really difficult conversations. We got some really tough questions about the nature of the research committee, and I felt like that was very powerful. So I guess kind of drilling down, like the process was something that I hope was meaningful for the folks serving on the committee. And I do feel like we really came out kind of recognizing the limits of who was on it, including all of us, no matter what our identities were, and that the representation would really occur in the next phase, looking to especially the Charter Review Commission as one process. So it was informative for that. And then also whatever the kind of community-driven policy development that needed to happen. And so I felt like we walked away with something I feel really proud of as almost like a tool that we can apply, that we have really important findings and information that will help us shape that next phase of community-centered conversation that is really vibrant and centers BIPOC voices.
Thank you, Jenny. I think, it's a arduous process to get through, and grateful that you all were there to help navigate that. So Kirsten, we have a question for you. Is there a reason to be concerned about district-based coalitions being formed to address district NIMBYism? Could probably throw in lots of other kind of issues.
So district-based coalitions being formed to address NIMBYism?
My reading of this question is, would there be concern that when you move to a district-based system that coalitions would form in those coalitions to prevent or promote issues like NIMBYism that people within that district are really supportive of citywide?
So like maybe there would be a NIMBY coalition within a district, which would then send somebody to council who would veto YIMBY policies? Something? Yes. Okay. So I would say that NIMBYism is a thing that a lot of Portlanders support, and that yes, if there was a 3-winner district and 1/3 of the people there wanted not in my backyard, they could elect one NIMBY councillor, which would be fair. That would put their voice on council. But if they were only 1/3 and they only got one councillor, then that councillor would be able to bring the NIMBY point of view, but they would not be able to override and force a NIMBY view if that was not what the majority of Portlanders wanted. So, the way it works is you get that voice in the conversation, which is important. But if they're not the majority, they don't get to control the conversation.
Thank you. So this is a question for anyone. I'm fascinated by this too. I'm curious about what the answer is. We might have to piecemeal this together from all of our collective intelligence. What is our upcoming city commissions makeup geographically? What parts of the city they live in? We have Wheeler, Hardesty, Rubio, Maps, Ryan.
Can I just say one thing about this?
Right now.
It's not, yeah, no. Look, if I mention one thing, which is that part of what's interesting with this, that actually gets back to previous councils as well. And we kind of learned this as a committee when we talked actually with some current council members. People have different assumptions about where people live in the city. And so people, because of they basically impress upon them, oh, this is a person who really represents Northwest or Southeast or something, but they don't necessarily know where they live in town. And I'll say, I can't say except for maybe Ted Wheeler for obvious reasons, I don't know where everyone lives around town. You know, what districts they're in, what parts of the city they're in. I don't know.
I feel like we need someone to do a quick Google search for us.
I think we might be, are we majority east of the river now, I think we must be at least at 3.
Hardesty, Rubio. I know Dan Ryan lives east of the river.
Yeah, and
Yeah.
I believe Mingus Maps does as well. So I think we may have gone to that, but I think kind of, speaking to the assumptions, if you go through inner Southeast Portland, but also as neighborhoods have changed, I mean, what a neighborhood might have been like 20 years ago, it can be pretty significantly different, and speaks to, it's a dynamic city.
Yeah, and so we've got some work to do. So final question before we wrap up the panel part of the discussion tonight. I want to hear from all of you. What do you think? What are our next steps here? What do we think about next from the perspectives that you all bring to this conversation? Maybe I'll do a Pedro, why don't you go with first?
It sounds like you're already thinking about this, which is engaging with the communities that would be most impacted by a change to the electoral system, and engaging with them to understand, like, do they feel represented? And if they don't, like, well, what, here's a system that would, perhaps a ranked choice voting system that would force candidates to reach out to their communities, or that would lower the barriers to be able to win an election by lowering the amount of votes to basically be more proportional to the electorate, or engage in those questions about what it is they think would best serve their needs. And I think that conversation is sometimes something that people overlook, but I do think it is an important one. I know that in my work, in previous work that I've done as well, is that we ask some of these threshold questions, like, would having a voice make a difference in an impact in your life? Like, was there a vote? Was there a soccer field that was closed because we didn't have a vote on that city council or a community center? Or, what does that look like? And really translating, like, what representation could mean in terms of policy, I think is a good approach. And if it's ranked choice voting that you're landing towards, you can reach out to us and we can obviously help with whatever resources that we have to bring that about.
Awesome, thank you. Mark, what are your thoughts on our next steps?
Yeah, I mean, I think the thing that stands out for me is that the obvious thing in front of us, or in front of the city, is the Charter Commission and the work that it's going to do. But there's other ways of, I think, as Pedro got to, there's other ways of getting to putting pressure on the system to make changes. And eventually that could be things like initiatives, but really just more conversations need to happen with an action orientation to those conversations, including, as was already talked about, what sort of voting method might ultimately be the one that Portland prefers the most. And that's going to involve some more conversation, because there's a lot of pros and cons, as we've already talked about.
Great, thank you. Kristen? Thoughts next?
Yeah, I I agree with what Pedro and Mark just said, and I just want to actually give some props to Pedro, who just did exactly what he was saying and reached out to community members in Albany to find out what really mattered to them and what their pain point was. And it ended up with a ballot initiative for multi-winner ranked choice voting passing with overwhelming support in that city. So talking to people and finding out what matters and what can solve the problems that they're experiencing can be very successful. So I hope to see something like that happening in Portland.
Awesome. Thank you. Thank you, Pedro. Congratulations. Jenny.
Right. Well, I am very excited to work collectively on the process of broader community and political education around the work of Portland's democracy. So I think folks, they recognize an issue, and we've done the work to draw together a lot of the policy options, and it is that application and finding out what folks want. And I think that the Charter Commission is an opportunity, regardless of what recommendations come out of it. I think it is a site that we can really use to build that momentum and take advantage of community engagement opportunities. And then whatever it may go to toward the ballot, that's going to involve really building a coalition and organizing. But at the heart of it, it feels kind of like it's an exciting opportunity and almost like an adventure. You know, I keep thinking after having done this, like, I don't know what people are going to say their priority is, because when we haven't yet had these conversations and the political education that will enable people to develop and decide what their preferred policy solutions are. And these are really fundamental issues. And so moving at that rate, speed of community and specifically centering BIPOC communities in this is going to be critical. But I think it is, things are converging. So it is time to really delve into that work.
Awesome. Thank you all. Now I'm going to turn it back over to Leslie.
Wow, that was a great discussion, wasn't it? And it's something to think about, that the quality of the discussion, the scope and the depth might only have been possible on Zoom in a virtual setting. We only wish we had more time. Thank you, Iris, and thank you, Kristen, Pedro, Mark, and Jenny for sharing your expertise and perspectives with us tonight. Now is time for City Club members to begin to vote. If you are already a member, by now you should have received an email that will allow you to cast a simple up-down vote on the research. If you feel the research was carried out faithfully and its conclusions follow from the findings, you can vote to approve the research. You have until Monday morning at 9 a.m. to cast your ballot. If you'd like to become a member, it's not too late to join. Go to www.pdxcityclub.org/membership to sign up, and then email info@pdxcityclub.org to have a ballot sent to you. Before you float off for the evening, I want to give you all a moment to consider giving a gift to fund City Club's activities. As we've seen over the past few years, welcoming inclusive and thoughtful civic spaces is more important than ever. Tonight, you can be part of rebuilding our civic infrastructure in Portland and in Oregon. To give to City Club, text Support City Club, that's all one word, Support City Club, to 44-321, or visit our website at www.pdxcityclub.org/donate. And again, if you'd like to become a City Club member tonight, it's www.pdxcityclub.org/membership. Thank you all for being part of tonight's discussion. Thank you, Iris, for co-hosting with me. Thank you to the Research Committee for all your hard work on this research project. And thank you to our sponsors, More Equitable Democracy and Luke Caney's, for supporting our work. Have a good night, everyone. Look for more opportunities to participate in Portland's prospect of changing government soon. And check out the new Medium publication called Portland City Charter Perspectives. There you'll find videos, blog posts, news items, and more about why there's so much more momentum right now for reforming Portland city government. I hope you all have a good evening. And if you'd like to write your own blog post, email charterperspectives@pdxcityclub.org. Thank you for participating. We see you. We appreciate you. We look forward to meeting again in person in the future. Be safe and good night.